at the end of the day, the visa rejection is a polite reason for rejection, but it is not the real reason for why you're getting rejected. I think at the end of the day, every employer is basically saying, is this person going to add value to my company? And the way they normally think about it is, does this person come with the sufficient industry experience, sufficient role experience, and sufficient country experience?
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey, so this is an interesting start because what we have is we have a Q&A of myself from an anonymous listener of the podcast. And I figured this actually would be an interesting conversation to have that would be helpful for many folks who are curious about US versus Singapore versus Southeast Asia technology ecosystem, but also I think a career perspective. And I hope that this is not only an honest reflection of my own career, but also something that might be helpful for those who are in a similar predicament or situation. So maybe could you introduce your context, whatever you're comfortable with at a high level, anonymous way?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, for having me. So I've been working in the finance industry for the past 6 years, and I'm looking towards the US Bay Area for career opportunities to switch industries into roles that are at a startup, at an early stage startup, understanding how big tech is no longer hiring as much. So I'm looking to opportunities over there, and being in my 30s and having been married, for me, moving out to the US is something I feel like is the right point of time in my life. And there are many questions around moving, and I'm really curious to find out more today, Jeremy, on that.
I really empathize with this question because, the reality is I did do that move, right? If you look at my career, I think it's quite transparent that obviously I grew up in Singapore, I was in the army, then I studied at UC Berkeley for undergraduate. And then, so I had to make a decision to go there. And then after that, I made a decision to come back to Singapore. I work as a management consultant at Bain, right? And after that, I made a decision to go back to the US to study. And then after that, I made a decision to build a company in the US in Boston, New York, and stay there. And then after that, I made a decision to come back to Singapore and then stay in Singapore to, through the pandemic, start a family, VC, as well as now a startup. And now I also travel and work because the company handles both Singapore side and the US side, right? So I think there's an interesting dynamic where I've always been shuttling between those 2 countries. So I guess from your perspective, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I think through applying jobs in the US from Singapore, one of the key things is I first started off with LinkedIn, and I realized like how slow things are. Like by the time it reaches LinkedIn, it's already too late sometimes. And for me, I guess the greatest struggle was having to answer the question, do you need a visa to enter the US? For me, I think that was a screener. And like most of the time, you get instant rejection. After like 2 days, you just get rejection from the different companies that you applied to. So I think for me, I feel like the greatest struggle is understanding the space from where you are here in Singapore. And the second is getting past that visa, because I know that Singaporeans have the H1B1, which is a non-lottery visa that allows you to more or less work in the US with minimal costs. And only 20% of 20% of the pool of visas are used every year. So that for me, I think the greatest challenge in these 2 parts.
Yeah, I totally resonate with you. And I think the first thing we have to recognize, of course, is that it's, of course, a big privilege for Singaporeans to have an H1B1 visa, right? I mean, it's very, very difficult to have that even visa availability, right? Which is a function of this US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. And so I think that creates a lot of actually, in reality, a lot of talent mobility, I think, between Singapore and the US, which is by design. And this is actually an order of magnitude easier than what's available for our Southeast Asian neighbors, right? So if you're Indonesian, Vietnamese, Malaysian, I think you're going to struggle because you don't have that same effectively unlimited visa quota that they have because they've compete in the general H1B, lottery, right? And that's not only under a lot of stress because there's a lot of competition from the I think the Indian and Chinese populations, which are obviously huge, but also it's a lottery-based system, right? So it's not skill-based. So again, it kind of like creates this huge amount of uncertainty for other folks. So I think the first thing is I think as for the Singaporeans, I think there is that one level of benefit. I would say is for sure the visa. I think the second type of benefit that you have actually is that coming from Singapore and from the rest of East Asia, Singapore and the US have similar GDP per capita, so about $90,000 US. Versus if you come from one of our Southeast Asian neighbors, your GDP per capita could be anywhere between 4,000 to 10,000 to 13,000, right? So it depends. I mean, basically it's like an order of magnitude difference of about, 10 to 20 times difference of that GDP per capita. And that's important because what we are saying is that I think from an American employer's perspective, I think they are quite aware of Singapore as a country. Don't get me wrong, of course, a lot of people still don't understand it fully. I was talking to this college and as admissions counselor, literally, she was like, "Oh, Singapore, which part of China is it in?" Right? And I was like, the stereotypes are true. But in general, I would say that employers would be okay with Singapore. So I don't think, because I think if they see another Southeast Asian country, there's actually even more like an active selection effect where they're just like, okay, this is not transferable. And then thirdly, of course, is actually the third benefit you have is you're actually in finance, right? Which is a little bit more transferable as a skill set to the US, because I think if you were, I'm just saying that, like supply chain or something a little bit more esoteric, I think that could be a little bit more difficult to move, right? Or maybe you're doing agriculture because you're in Southeast Asia and you're in agri-tech. Again, that'll be a difficult skill to port over. So I think we just have to recognize those three advantages, right? Again, from Singapore, you have the H1B1 visa, and you actually have a pretty decent, I would say, degree of background, both educationally and so forth. So I put that one side, and I want to say what is on my mind, which is I think that at the end of the day, the visa rejection is a polite reason for rejection, but it is not the real reason for why you're getting rejected, right? I think at the end of the day, every employer is basically saying, is this person going to add value to my company? And the way they normally think about it is, does this person come with the sufficient industry experience, sufficient role experience, and sufficient country experience? And obviously, I think people get surprised by the last one because, I think it's always implied that when you're hiring, always tend to hire domestically. But I think that's really important because in America, there's so many immigrants. But even in Singapore, you can imagine we have the same situation, right? We have lots of people applying for us from the region. And there's always that question, which is, yes, there is a bit of a hurdle to get the employment pass. And yes, there's that hurdle to get the H1B1 visa, which is less, but still quite a bit of work. It's always going to, but it's a very polite way to also reject for all the other criteria. So I really want to solve. And what's my implication? I would say, I'll just name it off the bat is common errors that I have heard and seen Singaporeans do is one is, first of all, applying from Singapore. So their LinkedIn says Singapore, they are, doing everything remotely. The truth is probably have to find this job in a function of in-person, relocate your persona, in that sense to the US or already be in the US, whether you're on a tourist visa, whatever it is, networking, socializing, talking to people, getting that in-person job referral. So I think that's really important. Number one, you can't really do.
So your advice will be to change your LinkedIn to SF or like LE to just help with the algorithms.
I think that's one, because at least, and two is really spend the time there, right? I'm not asking you to fake out the person. I'm just saying, change, scroll, take a, in Singapore, you have visa-free travel to the US, so you can spend, quite a good chunk of time there in the US. So I would make it a reality. I would move there, interview in person, talk to people in person, get job referrals in person, and change your LinkedIn as well. So I think that's one, which is of course quite scary because that obviously means you have to leave a job, right? So I think that's the first thing. Number two is you have to recognize that it's difficult to do a triple jump, right? So one I mentioned was job criteria from an employee perspective is from an employee perspective, you are doing one of the most difficult things right now based on what you've just told me, right? Which is again, you're trying to change from finance to startups, which is changing industry. And by the way, startups is the many kinds of industries, right? There's supply chain startups, there's quantum startups. So maybe I would recommend you to try to apply towards only finance startups, right? Because at least you're not changing the industry as much. Some of that is relevant, number one. And number two is you're changing your role, right? Because from your finance role towards an operator role, there's a big change in role. And three, you're changing geography. So you don't have the networks experience. And I think maybe one way to say it is like, if you were in Singapore and you were hiring for an employee, would you hire somebody who, let's say your startup is let's use this exact same approach, right? Like in Singapore, you're running a finance startup, is small, fast growing, and servicing the region, right? And then you have an job application from somebody in America. He's American, never been to Southeast Asia, applying remotely, comes from supply chain, right? And has never done a role before, right? And then you're just gonna be like, well, there's auto rejection, and a polite way for me to say it is, sorry, we don't sponsor visas. Right? I think this would be very important is that in the US, there's also legal requirement that pretty much they have stopped giving you the real reason why they can't tell you your fit and experience, because it tends to be a magnet for HR lawsuits actually now in the US. So we used to give feedback to employee candidates, right? And then after that, we eventually got a lawsuit threat. He was basically saying that we were discriminating against him. And it was just a very big puzzler for us, because we were just telling him the feedback like, hey, like the deliverable wasn't a good fit for what we needed to do. Anyway, but and then after that, as a company, we just stopped giving feedback on why people were rejected, right? So we just either didn't respond or so forth, right? So I think I think that's where I want you to be thoughtful about.
Yeah, no, I think that's super helpful to think about it, Jeremy. Like the notion of three jumps, it's going to be difficult, and one has to kind of like do one of the trade-offs. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of nuance I'll have here is that therefore the actionable thing is try to do only one jump at a time. I think if you're really good or you're doing like something else, you can probably do 2 jumps and so what I mean by that is if your primary goal is to change geography, and we have to dig into why you want to change geography as well. But if your primary goal is to change geography, my advice to you is stick in finance, stick to an equivalent type of organization and go for that role, right? Rather than, so then at least from the employer perspective, it's like, okay, this person is a slam dunk, knows the skill, does the exact same job role, crushed it. It's just that happens to be moving from, and then, somebody is more likely to be a champion for you, right? So I think that's one piece. Try to keep it as much as possible a single jump. The second piece I would say is, obviously, I would look at maybe companies who have Singaporean founders or Singaporean leadership. So obviously, they're going to be more familiar with the visa situation. They themselves probably went through that same process. So I would probably be thoughtful about approaching those, because then at least you have a internal champion who can at least explain that to HR, like, hey, it's straightforward and there's not really a visa issue. There's no uncertainty about the person clinching the visa. Really matter of time and effort and administration work, which is still, a problem for HR always, who's often doing this first screening. But at least you have an internal champion to push you through. 3 is I'll probably go for larger organizations rather than smaller, because at the end of the day, that HR admin is probably harder for a small organization than a large organization, unless they're staff or talent. But if they're staff or talent, they may prefer to hire you remotely, right? And keep you here rather than, bring you in and go through that hassle. And then lastly, number 4 is, you should also consider either like a graduate school program as well, and kind of going through the student OPT track, which is basically a post-graduate school like work opportunity for that visa, which can eventually be converted into H1B1 and so forth. But I think it's very there's a lot of familiarity in the American HR system to hire fresh graduates who are international immigrants, but at least have that student visa. And that's very easy for them to process internally, but also very easy conceptually for them to work on.
Makes sense. Yeah. I think what's interesting, speaking to people, then talk about the idea of like doing a master's or something like that and the likes of that. And what I realized is that the hit rate for people who graduate from master's program is starting to drop over time. Like I noticed that there's a statistic of like certain Ivy League schools, like 6 months after graduating, 60% are still unemployed. So that was quite interesting for me. I was just like, okay, so if you take a shot at an MBA program or something that likes of that, you're stopping your salary and then you're going to take extra costs on for 40% probability. So that's quite interesting.
Well, 40% probability is pretty good, actually. It depends on what kind of risk appetite you have, right? Like if you told me, hey, Jeremy, you have 40% chance of getting it, yeah, I would be like, hey, that's pretty good odds. But maybe that's why I'm startups and more entrepreneurial. Because, like there's nothing that's 100% in life. I think that's one. But 2 is like, hey, you're pushing for a 40% chance of getting that geographic allocation and experimentation that you want, right? 3 is a 1 to 2 year program, maybe to, kind of like see the country for yourself and see where they actually want to do it, right? Because there's lots of people who go to America and then after that decide to go somewhere else, right? Last point is, out of that group as well, a lot of people go back to countries because the countries are better, right? What I'm just trying to say here is like, I think the odds are better than 40% from my perspective, and you just have to work hard at it and just take the opportunity to experiment.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. Different tracks to being where you want to be. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think the also thing is, if you think about that master's program is, I think there's an interesting conversation to be like, do you want it to be something that specializes who you are versus something that broadens you out a little bit, right? And I think that's also an interesting piece or debate that you have. Obviously, if you think about it from a startup perspective, like, I think the reality is that obviously the world is going through a huge amount of change, right? So if you asked me like 5 years ago, I would have said, yeah, if you go to the US, go take a master's in computer science, right? And then you're probably going to get a computer engineering job because there's a huge shortage of computer engineers in the US 5 years ago. Now, obviously, with the AI, revamp or overhaul of, the productivity of engineers, and now there's this AI-driven layoffs, right, of engineers at a junior level. I think it makes it a little bit more difficult to say what kind of master's program to go for. It's hard for me even to say which one it is. But I think at least you got to have that conversation with yourself to be like, is this something that lets me specialize more in finance and makes me a super no-brainer, right? And I think there is that role, right? Finance, can you become, I'm using an example, right? Audit, internal accountant. Like you have to have internal accountants. It's a pain. There's a lot of productivity that has to be there, but can you become a controller and handle the finance operations? I mean, the example, because you're in finance, that's one side of it. Versus, again, it goes back to your role, right? Like what kind of role requires them to be in person? Probably something like leadership, something that's in person. I don't know. There's some debate there that happens. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, bring your tool set like FP&A to the table, and that gives you more value proposition. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's a little bit, but of course, what it means by that is probably to get your CPA, your CFA in your scenario, right? Because to qualify for that, you need those things to get that level. I'm not saying that I'm telling you to do it. I'm just saying that if your goal is to specialize in finance and say like, okay, my job is to be a no-brainer startup controller or finance leadership because it's a, then I think there's something to be said there, right? But it's not an easy role for sure. So again, are you going to try to go more generalist? I think the tricky part is about generalist is, are you really better than everybody else, right? It depends what's the demand there and what's your skill set. So it goes back to your resume and background.
That makes sense. The skill sets that you bring to the table, as well as the so-called licenses, CFA and all of that. Yeah.
So why do you want to move to the US?
Having like read all the different trends, innovation, I believe that Silicon Valley is still one of the highest concentration of skills, innovation, and human capital. It's vastly different if you look at the job markets there, the job ads and all of that, versus let's say a market like Singapore or Hong Kong. It's very different. Yeah. So, and I think the innovation that's coming there, the iteration pace is something that I want to plug myself into. Whereas in Singapore, it's still a bit like waiting for regulations, waiting for bigger companies to move, and there's also a very conservative mindset. So I think it's just like flexing oneself to get a different mindset, which you can't get it off like LinkedIn by reading thought leadership. That would be my case for why go to US.
Yeah, no, I just looked at your LinkedIn profile just to check. Yeah, you don't have any US specific experiences in terms of like having been there, right? And I think that's actually a really important piece because I actually agree with you, right? I mean, I think Silicon Valley is the number one technology ecosystem. I know during the pandemic, people were arguing the pandemic was killing it and it's now Florida, is the rest of the world. But now I think the consensus has landed back that at the end of the day, there's a technology flywheel in Silicon Valley, right? I mean, and it's kind of, even right now in this conversation, is demonstrating the power of it, right? Which is it has the appeal to high risk, high reward individuals who want to bring their talent to their universities like UC Berkeley and Stanford. They'll be there. They'll be happy to do your masters for you, bring you into the industry. And obviously the startups will all compete with one another. So they're always fighting for talent and they're going to, and there's always a new technology wave, right? Whether that was VR, 8 years ago or crypto or, now it's AI. There's always a new boom, and in California, weather and quality of life makes it very appealing for everybody, right? And so I think we have to admit that, just like how Silicon Valley crushed the Boston, I always tell people it's like in the 1950s, 1960s, Boston used to be the Silicon Valley of America. And then since the 1980s, Silicon Valley has crushed Boston, right? And then I think that talent ecosystem is so strong as a flywheel that I think we just have to structurally say this. I'm not going to be super diplomatic and just be like, all ecosystems are the same and every ecosystem is a good ecosystem, right? I'm just going to say like, I think there's a very strong gravitational pull in the US. And I would say that it's even more obvious when I say something like, hey, you want to be a world-class actress, right? Or dancer. Most people are going to be like, oh, you got to move to New York or Los Angeles, right? I mean, it's, so because all of us would say like, hey, and I always never forget that when I was in New York and working, and obviously I was taking all these like, for fun, like as hobby, I would go for like comedy classes and just, hang out. And what was the difference between Boston, comedy classes and New York comedy classes was like, there were people, but 1/3 of the class wanted to be professional, comedians or actors. And the other 1/3 were actually from comedic or entertainment industries. And then I was part of the last third, which was professionals who are very stressed at work. So hanging out with, to learn a new skill set and enjoy life and whatever it is. I mean, it's a hobby, right? But I was like, wow. So 1/3 of them were like working in the entertainment industry. So they were like already dancing. They were already working for Saturday Night Live or, Stephen Colbert show. So they're producers and they're just doing it because they are like, I mean, it's like work adjacent, right? It's like a hobby still, but, it's still very work adjacent, right? It'd be the equivalent of, I don't know, a venture capital guy going to do his, CPA or CFA. It's like very work adjacent component, qualification or credential component. There's another 1/3 of people who actually wanted to be professional comedians. So they were like working hard and going to stand-up bars, playing at gigs, and just pushing very hard because they knew that if they climbed all the way, they would climb all the way to becoming, Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Kimmel, or even, obviously Ronnie Cheng, right? He's a classic example. Studied in Singapore, and then from Singapore, he moved to the US, and then from US, he moved to, New York, and then he was able now to get to, obviously a Daily Show. He likes to have that angle. It's like, oh, I'm an immigrant and America sucks for these reasons in a very teasing way, but that's his persona, fine, okay. I think the good argument was, could somebody reach that global stardom in Malaysia or in Singapore or even San Francisco, right? The answer would be a struggle, right? Because he had to move to the right ecosystem. Even Robbie Williams, right? Obviously a comedian, was not a success in San Francisco. I mean, he was funny, he was great. He only found stardom when he moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles, right? So we're not really saying America is the best ecosystem. We're just saying Silicon Valley is really the best technology ecosystem. Los Angeles, Hollywood's stardom and influencer ecosystem. New York obviously has his, news. And I mean, so all I'm just trying to say here is I totally agree with you about that. I think those are the benefits. I think what's also interesting actually, as a mild counterpoint, of course, is you also see the opposite, right? And I have to say this counterpoint because otherwise people are going to say like, hey, Jeremy, you're not a patriot for Southeast Asia. And why are you in Southeast Asia, Singapore now? But actually, I was just hosting a brunch with, 3 other, kind of like Singaporean Southeast Asian families, that relocated. And I'll say that every 2 weeks, I'm probably getting a call outreach from somebody who's kind of relocating back from America back to Southeast Asia. And I think the question they have is quite set up different, but I think for them, I think they may be frustrated about 3 different things. One is I think they're frustrated about quality of life in America, I would say. So whether especially when they're like starting to raise a family, then cost of childcare, cost of healthcare, cost of safety, proximity to family for help and companionship, and even also to some extent cultural values about how they want to raise their children. These are all, I think, a big factor for, I'll say, quality of life, and because cost of living is really not easy in Silicon Valley. So I think that's number one. I think the second piece that often is a big driver is, I think, seeing business opportunities in Southeast Asia. So for them, obviously, there are ways to build companies in Southeast Asia. Grab and Gojek were founded by Harvard MBAs, right? Who came back because they were in America. They could use Uber. And so I think there's a lot of folks who are coming back to Southeast Asia to say like, okay, I understand the ecosystem and how it works, and I want to build something. And I think you see quite a few folks who are doing that, right? I think you see Kelvin come back. He went to build funding societies, right, across Asia, which is, fintech. Obviously, we now have Dennis. He's coming back to build, he mentioned building a search fund, but kind of like an acquisition vehicle, like a Berkshire Hathaway for, kind of like Asia, right? And so he's being inspired to come back. So he sees a business opportunity. And I think the third thing for reason why they come back, of course, I think they just don't see themselves as American in the long term, right? And I think that's actually a really important thing that's really important, is that I think when you're in America, people are very familiar with the word immigrant because the assumption is that you want to stay there forever, right? And I think some people want to go to America. Obviously, if you're coming from a country from 5,000 GDP per capita, going to $90,000 GDP per capita, whether that's Singapore, Australia, Switzerland, your economy is so far 30, 40, 50 years. Like this is literally a time travel machine to go to a place where you have great infrastructure, great opportunity. I think if you're like great talent and you want to move, that's why, so many people around the world want to migrate, right? And let's be super real, right? Like my great grandparents left China because it was a nightmare in their country at the time, right? There's disorder and crime and all these other stuff. And so they left the country as immigrants or refugees in that sense, right? And my set of parents basically ended up in, at that time, British Malaya, a colony of the British. And then eventually, kind of like I ended up in Singapore, right? I mean, out of this whole stack, right? So I'm a product of immigration or talent migration, however you want to look at it. So I think that's really important. What's the third point that I think is quite key is I think that after a certain number of years, you'll find out whether you want to become American, because you're staying long term, right? Because if you're not going to stay forever, then you end up actually becoming an expatriate. And I see this quite phenomenon, quite common actually, this third point, for I would say like people who come from Switzerland or France and they're working in the US or Australia, or Singaporean. Like, because the countries are actually quite equivalent to the US in terms of GDP per capita, infrastructure, arguably has its own strengths and weaknesses, but quite comparable. I find that sometimes they never become Asian American, or French American, right? They're just French. They just stay French. And I think when I say that, obviously it's quite obvious, right? It's like you see somebody who's American in Singapore, and are they here as an expatriate? Do they see themselves retiring, growing old, and going into a polyclinic for the healthcare, long term? Or are they going to become Singaporeans, American Singaporeans, in the sense that, they could become PR, for example, like stay long term, really live long term. So I think that's really the iceberg of it. That's what I want to say is like, is the counterpoint to it. Again, it goes back to it is, again, your I guess your quality of life or your aspirations for your life stage. And the second one is you see business opportunities. I think the last iceberg is when you go to America and stay there, do you want to become American, right? And I think that's the super fair question. And I think that's really the iceberg question. I would say like a lot of people talk about the first one because it drives the move. And the second one obviously is something they use to commercialize or think about the process. But I think that underlying emotional values piece is actually a huge piece. Actually, I know lots of friends of mine who made the decision and say, I would love to become American, right? Whether they're Singaporean or from a country that, has less economic opportunities for them. But I'm just saying, like, I think you just have to be thoughtful about that process.
I think that's a very good flow to think about when you're moving, and also the value you bring to the table, as well as what's the long-term plan. Yeah, probably makes sense.
I'm just kind of curious about what else is on your mind regarding this move: benefits, costs, risks.
I think it's more of understanding also so I do have American counterparts, but have like working with colleagues from the US, helping them with strategies into APAC. That's part of my work. And just from your angle, what are some cultural nuances, having stayed there, that Singaporeans should take note of? I think that's more of that part, right? Like we've talked about career part, knowing where's your so-called person market fit, and then now is talking about culture, right? What are some things to take note of? Safety, of course, that's the number one. Singaporeans just love that, right? Safety. So like, yeah, maybe you could share a bit more on these two areas. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that again, I think the big similarity, of course, is the GDP per capita. So it's about same GDP per capita, and so it shows up like we listen to the same music, we watch the same TV shows, Netflix, right? So there's a lot of shared cultural DNA actually. So when you go to the US, at least my generation was like, oh, Britney Spears and Avril Lavigne, and everyone's like kind of like, yeah, we all know the music, right? And obviously now we're listening to Lady Gaga, or I think there's a lot of shared DNA because of the same GDP per capita, and I think that's how I think a lot of Europeans and I think the people who are are privileged enough to be born in these countries get to share that commonality. I think that's one piece. And obviously, a big commonality, of course, English-speaking, Anglophile components. I think that's going to be that is a huge, I think, ease, and that's not true for everybody, right? There's a lot of people who grew up in countries that are, of a different GDP per capita, and that can cause, I think, it's just then it becomes a difference, right, in social norms, right? So I think that's one thing that's easy. I would say the two things that are quite different, I would say, is that one, I think that America, obviously, I think racially is quite a different mix from Singapore. And obviously is a different mix from Southeast Asia, right? I mean, Vietnam is probably like vast majority Vietnamese, right? For example, right? I'm just giving an example, right? But I think if you go in Singapore, obviously it's a mix, we can say like what? 60% Chinese, or like there's Malay, there's Indian, but the mix is different obviously in America, right? So I think it's African Americans, right? Latinos, Asians, Caucasians. Sorry, there's always the debate about what term to use, and so I think it's just a different mix, and I think that mix is obviously such a, I think, wonderful experience. I think from my perspective, because I mean I have some really good friends of mine who across all of this, and I honestly got to learn about their own experiences and their own global experiences, whether they're migrating to America or whether they grew up in America. But I think that global mix is such a blessing actually, because I just didn't expect. It just makes some good connections, right? And and you learn stuff that you just never learned before, right? And it's interesting because it also creates that prism back on Southeast Asia. So, for example, in America, I was hanging out and I got to learn about redlining, which is like the concept of banks basically saying like this neighborhood is poor, so we can't give like housing loans, but actually those areas were primarily African American, right? So using poverty or status as a proxy for race, even though it's legally defensible, but it's unequal in outcomes, right? So these are historical practices that happened in 1960s, 1970s, and then you're like, okay, you get to learn about this stuff, and then you're like, okay, that actually applies in the rest of the world as well, right? Whether you like it or not. So I think there's this interesting gift, but it's definitely a different mix of demographics. So I think you just be aware. I think the third thing, of course, is actually, Singapore is still a blend between Asia and Western culture. So I think you're already like 50% there, but America is a pure American culture, right? So, and also I would say that Silicon Valley is also special, right? I mean, the Silicon Valley culture is very different from Midwestern culture as well, right? So I think we're quite careful to say it's not just all American, but we're talking about Silicon Valley. I'll say that in Silicon Valley, I think that in SF and Palo Alto, I think the biggest cultural difference that will quite quickly come out is, I think, very high risk, high reward. So I think if you're saying something like, oh, I want to do this step by step, people might say like, it's not visionary enough. So there's a very strong dynamic of high risk, high reward, kind of swinging for the home runs dynamic because of the VC ecosystem and so forth. So people ask you to keep dreaming bigger and bigger and bigger, which is not a bad thing. But I think it's just something for you to be thoughtful about. I think then, like the two other sub points of that, for example, would be, salesmanship and communication is going to be very important. I think there's this classic issue, people have is like in Singapore, it's like, humble servant leadership, kind of dynamic. And that's just not going to fly in Silicon Valley. It's very much like, I think it's still obviously a model of leadership and approach. But I think just the fact that if you're a startup, you just have to fight for attention, fight for media, fight for attention. People end up doing very, it's just a very like external oriented dynamic where you're just trying to get your message out there, right? And so you can't humility your way out and say, oh, my product is good, but these are all the bad things, and we're only 2% better than competition. And everyone's going to be like, why am I buying your product? So everybody's like, we are disruptive. We will destroy this occupation. The world will end because of my company, right? So that level of like salesmanship is actually very important, right? And I think people underweight that Silicon Valley is not just a technology ecosystem in terms of building, but it's also a salesmanship ecosystem, right? Like Steve Jobs, for example, he's a marriage of the charisma piece, communication piece, right, with the technology piece, right? We expect our engineers to be on video to do the product announcement, right? So there's that huge push for everybody to be able to communicate a vision. And the last point of that, of course, is I think that in Silicon Valley, there's so many people who are going to be like you, who are kind of coming in short term. Some of you go back to the home countries. Some of them may not get their visas and have to go back. Some will stay. Yeah. But there's a huge, I think, flatness to Silicon Valley. So when you come in, I think you'll feel like an outsider for sure because you're an immigrant or expat. But I think you will notice that there's just so many other founders who have been drawn there. They come from the Midwest. They come from East Coast. They're all young. They're all hungry. So I think you'll be able to network quickly, and there's a lot of ecosystem building activities like mixers and drinks and stuff like that. So I think it'll be like a wonderful blitz of getting to meet new people. It's just that the joke, of course, is that all those new people will all be in technology, right? And they're all doing AI, and they're all doing, there's a joke, that whatever technology flavor of the day, right? And I know people who have moved from SF to New York because they're so sick of technology. They're just like, how are people in real estate, law, so there's this classic like emoji that they have, right? It's like, in New York, you get to meet a lawyer, an accountant, a real estate guy, and a technology guy, right? And a media guy. So these are the people that you meet for your dinner party. And then you move to San Francisco, then you're talking to a startup lawyer, a startup real estate guy, a startup accountant, a startup media guy, and a startup engineer, right? So everybody is the same roles, but they're all in startups, right? And so I think, it depends on your flavor, but I think that's the opportunity that you get.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing on that. The whole idea of the immigration blood, the mindset of being able to market yourself well, that's different from the Southeast Asia way of doing things. Yeah, I think these are very, very good. An eye into how to operate things in America.
What's your biggest fear about this move?
Actually, not a lot of fear. It's really just the offer, right? the opportunity to work there.
You're more fearful about whether you'll be able to get a job, but you feel very certain that you want to do it.
Yeah, that's where I am in terms of my space. Yeah, because otherwise you spend many actually odd hours, right, talking to people from the US. Then if you have no conviction, then it's quite difficult.
Yeah. And what does your spouse think?
They're probably more excited than me, because I'm a person of routine. I like to go to the Cai Fan store to order the same thing. So for me, routine. I love routine, but I know that sometimes you have to, have chosen suffering, because life will throw unchosen suffering at you.
So your spouse is actually excited because it's more adventurous, it's opportunity.
Yeah, correct.
I really resonate with that, right? Because when I moved to America, I actually had a similar situation, right? I'm probably more maybe because of my army training, but I'm like disciplined, regimented, get stuff done, so for, and to some extent I was following a track, right? In the sense that, I went to UC Berkeley, I saw opportunity for a Harvard MBA, right? Along the way, I took it. So to some extent I was following a ladder and seeing, obviously still high risk, high reward, but still kind of regimented in his own way. But obviously my, then girlfriend, now spouse, obviously was quite excited about that opportunity and the experiences. So I think that's a good mind space to be in. I mean, I think that's also a big blessing, because I can tell you I also met other couples where they're not on the same page, right? And it's very, very difficult actually. And I don't want to underweight that, because, and like I said, I was at a brunch and, we had a bunch of Singaporeans and they all actually brought their international spouses back as well, because they're all raising families and everything in Singapore. I would say that it is not an easy scenario when you move your spouse, because at the end of the day, and it is something I always tell people, is like, the spouse, two spouses, you have to make each other's life dreams come true. So the book called Gottman, Gottman, and that's actually quite a difficult conversation to have, because I think we're past the age of arranged marriages, right? We had to stick together through thick or thin. Divorce is impossible, and long lives, right? So I think the moment like somebody feels like they have to sacrifice their life dream in order to be in a marriage, it's actually quite a difficult situation already. And I say this because right now I think this other person is excited because of his adventures and so forth, and you're going there because you think it's going to be a better work opportunity and so forth. And I can tell you that I've seen the other side of it, which is I've seen many people who are, for example, the work opportunities don't pan out, and so they want to come back to Southeast Asia, because turns out there's lots of multinational corporations that want to, hire a Singaporean general manager to handle the region. I'm just giving an example, right? Or maybe there's a business opportunity that now has been inspired and you've figured out a new opportunity in Southeast Asia because Southeast America has opened up your eyes to it. Or maybe another spouse is kind of like saying that this childcare situation doesn't make sense. We want to raise a family, or I want to be close to family. I don't want to be American. So I think moving there together is easy because both of you have the benefit of Hollywood, right? So, there's nothing wrong with America. Everything's great. And I think there's this, cartoon, and I can't remember the exact out there, but it's about mice who travels to New York from Europe. It's something like a mouse's tail. I can't remember what it is, but when they're in the boat with all the other mice moving from America, fleeing Europe to go to America.
Yeah.
They sing this song, right? It's like, there are no cats in America. And so basically, they basically were singing and it's like, wow, in America, the streets are made of cheese. There are no cats in America. And whereas there are many cats in Europe, America's fantastic. And of course, they land in New York and then it turns out there's still cats, right? And it's a very different place. So I think when you're moving that together, I think there's this huge conception of America. The ideal of America is so big that you can fit both life dreams in it. But I think once you're in it in Silicon Valley, once your spouse and you both have to find jobs and may struggle and so forth, and then the cost of living, and obviously you think about family life stages. So, obviously if you choose to be child free, then obviously that's all power to you. But obviously, all income, no kids is much easier to do in America than having kids. I would say, I think everybody understands there's a little bit of a childcare cost crisis in America. Yeah. So I'm just trying to say here is like moving to America is easy because it's exciting in your scenario, right? But I think that dream can sour pretty quickly for one spouse rather than other. And I've actually literally seen divorces break up happen because one person is maybe crushing it. Maybe, they're enjoying life. They're like, another person is not crushing it. I'm just giving an example, right?
Yep.
And then there's going to be a very difficult conversation that happens there, right? And my advice to you at that point is like, I'm not saying that stay married. I'm saying you to get divorced, right? Because I'm not going to be one of those guys who's like, you must stay married no matter what. And like what? Yeah. I'm going to be like, please get divorced and go create a unicorn. If you have a choice between building a unicorn in Silicon Valley or build a unicorn and be divorced and happily married and whatever it is, I can't give you that justification, right? I mean, Jeff Bezos, married, divorced, married. Elon Musk as well has his own set of relationship history. I don't know what decision you're going to make at that point, but what I'm just going to say is that there's no way in life that both people's careers will always be totally aligned. And so my advice to you is actually like really just be intentional about saying down, okay, yes, it's exciting, but what is your life dream? Is it kids? Is it to raise a family? Is it to build a unicorn startup of your own? Is it, like really nail down that life dream? Because I just don't want you to end up in a situation where like in 3 to 4 years, you're just going to be like, oh no. I think, okay, it'll be easy when both of you are not getting there. Okay. If both of you are not getting there, then both of you are going to be like, well, you know what? Maybe we'll move back to Singapore. Right. And because we saw it, we came, we saw, we learned, we returned to, to Southeast Asia, right? If both are not doing well in America, that will be an easy conversation, right? But I think it's quite rare for both people to be doing well in America at the same time because it's just a big immigration / expat experience. So I just want to say like this, really stay in touch with your spouse, if that makes sense. And keep having that check-in every, in the start, every month, then every quarter. But just be like, okay, how are you feeling? This is your life dream that we know. Is this country serving you the way? And what do we need to do to make it happen? And I think if you have that intentional conversation, then at least you're not going to be blindsided by it. Resentment can build up, I think, between both parties as well.
Yeah. That's good advice. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult. I tell you. I mean, because, like when you date somebody, you're just dating because you like each other, right? Let's go on dates and whatever it is. Then once you get married, you're like, you got married because, at least I don't know about you, but for me, it was a natural progression because you like this person so much, so you get married, right? I think to stay married is not easy. That's what I'm telling people, right? It is his own accomplishment, right? And that's why every Instagram video, is like, wow, how did you stay married for 60 years? And, this old guy or this old woman has some secrets, like, everybody laughs at their wisdom, right? Whatever it is, right? But I think what I'm just trying to say here is like, I think it's hard to have the self-awareness to know your own life dream. And it's also very scary to share your own life dream with somebody else. And it's also very scary to hear somebody else's true life dream and then try to make both work. And that is so hard because by definition of life dream is so hard. It is so hard, right? And the truth is, if some life dreams are not compatible, right? A simple one that you and I probably know is like, I think you and I both know couples who are like, one person was like, my life dream is to have kids. And then somebody's life dream is like, no kids in that picture. And then they still got married anyway. And then after that, they end up getting divorced. I mean, it's very common actually, right? I mean, and so because they just never had that conversation before getting married, right? And that's why nowadays, a lot of people recommend premarital counseling, to be like, hey, it's scary to have that conversation, but maybe you have to have that conversation, right? So I think that's that's the most obvious one, right? But now you're talking about country, geography, career, lifestyle, identity. It can be difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely setting yourself up for success when you're in the US. Otherwise, you have the cost of living to deal with, you have safety, and then you have a broken marriage.
I said, I know people who are divorced and they're happy, and I know people who are divorced and kind of like regret it, right? I think I'm not saying that marriage is forever, but I'm just saying like this is a high stress.
Yeah.
It's really not and that would be, I think, a bigger determinant. And it's also a determinant for people who are returning to Southeast Asia from America as well, right? Because, obviously I can tell you right now that for all of those spouses, all of them had one person who was doing better in America, or at least, saw a long-term future in America, right? So, all of them really made a decision, right? But I also know lots of, other spouses who made a similar decision and they are staying in America, right? To be with each other. So it's not, it's really not easy, because everything else you can do virtually. Like what I mean by that is you can study virtually, you can work virtually, you can even learn virtually, you can listen to music virtually, but you really can't have a marriage virtually, So, like this long distance relationship makes sense when you're dating, but as a marriage, it doesn't work, right? So raising a kid is proximity, right? So I think for the people who are geographically mobile, I think that's a really important piece. Yeah. Any last thoughts or questions?
Is there any question I should have asked you that people commonly ask you, but I have not asked you today?
I think that most people would ask me, should I move to America or somewhere else? I mean, as an example, right? Or stay in Singapore or Southeast Asia, right? I would say. So I would say that what strikes me a little bit different is I feel like your mind is a little made up. And that's okay, actually, because I think right now you have you've never been and worked and studied and worked in America. So we're fighting against the ideal of America. Does it make sense as a work location? Versus, for example, some people have never worked in Europe, right? So a lot of people are like, oh, I would love to work in Greece because, Mediterranean and, good lifestyle and drink olive oil every day, right? And then obviously you travel to Greece and you live and work there and life is totally different because, they have their own economic struggles. You can't, there's no technology ecosystem there. Obviously they have great olive oil and weather is not the same, right? I mean, so to me, I think I'm not truly surprised that America has that draw because you've never really studied or worked there. But I think but I would say that a lot of people who have some exposure or at least a little bit more uncertainty might ask that question, should I move to America? And I think that's actually an interesting question because I think from an economist perspective, it's very much like, the math is like, for example, where are you going to earn more money over the long term, right? I'm just saying,
Correct.
and so, like you already, based on your profile and everything, I see a strong future for you in Singapore, right? I think there's a lot of career ladders you can climb and there are many good roles that are available in Singapore and at your level. And so I would say that, financially you might do well in Singapore. I'm just an example, right? And Singapore, like we discussed, is not the number one technology ecosystem in the world, but I think it's quite comparable to London or LATAM. I mean, as an example, right? Like I think there's a really strong case for Singapore as a technology ecosystem, right? So the sacrifice is not as huge as if I was, for example, I have friends, for example, in the Philippines, right? Who are very much saying like, I want to move to America to join the technology ecosystem, right? And I think everybody will agree that Philippines is not Singapore and Singapore is not Silicon Valley, right? So I'm just saying like there's that double jump. So for them, the magnitude is even larger, right? In that upside. So I think, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't, obviously I'm not saying that you should, but I think that question often, I find it's helpful because what it boils down to is it may not necessarily just be an economic reason to move to America. It may be just like a symbolic component, right? Which is, and I want to say symbolic in two ways, right? One is the symbol of America as a land of freedom, free press, democracy, deals, Lady Gaga, and Silicon Valley, high risk, high reward, open AI. So I think that's really like the ideal of America. And this is such a powerful symbol. And you really have to give credit to, I guess, America as a whole thing where they really continue to have that brand image, I guess, of that shining city on the hill. And I really don't want to underweight that. And I think there are many aspects that's real of it, but it's real, it's true, and it can be that shining city on the hill for the people who want to do it. But I'm just saying that there is a gap between the external outsider perception of it from the outside versus the actual live reality inside. And I'm sure if you go to Reddit threads, Reddit/San Francisco or Reddit/Palo Alto, I'm sure, you will see some of that resident point of view of that, right? Just like maybe another way of looking at it is like the view of Singapore from America is Crazy Rich Asians, but there's that shiny reality. And obviously everybody who was in Reddit/Singapore is going to be like, we have all these problems and all this other stuff, right? So I just want to say like, there's that symbolism of America that you just have to be more thoughtful about rather than just career, and I think that symbolism is really important because once you're there, I think that will both immunize you from being disappointed, but also let you be more pragmatic in that conversation when you are there or start having a conversation there. And then the other side I would actually say is the other symbol is about leaving Singapore. And I think that's actually a big driver for a lot of people as well, because they don't like Singapore for whatever reason. I mean, and I think there's lots of reasons to not like Singapore, right? By the way, right? I mean, I'm the first one where I was like, oh my God, it's so hot out there. I have to be in aircon all the time. Would I want to be in San Francisco with my nice sweater and vest? There's a push and pull, right? The pull of America or Silicon Valley is there. You just have to be aware about the reality. But what are the push factors about Singapore? And I think sometimes it takes time to, the joke that people often have about Singapore is like, sometimes you have to leave Singapore in order to appreciate Singapore more, right? So I think that's very much a true case for me, is like very much like, I'll just give you a classic example, be like, growing up as a kid, I used to walk home, right? And it'd be like 11 p.m., midnight or 1 a.m. And I'll be like, I'll just walk home. You know what I mean? It's like, there's no bus or whatever. I'll just walk home and enjoy the time and listen to some music. Yeah, I mean, and then, you're suddenly in like, San Francisco, right? And you just can't do that because there's crime and safety, and you never walk by yourself late at night, listening to music, through your headphones. You're like a total mugging candidate. I mean, everybody. So it's not just the fact that there's obviously more crime. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong. Lots of countries have more crime. I think Singapore's abnormal. I think no crime, effectively.
Yeah.
But But I think that magnitude difference is not just a crime statistic perspective, but it becomes a cultural difference, right? Because, coming back to Singapore, my wife and I started cycling at night, right? So we cycle at, 7 p.m. to midnight, and it's such a weird thing to do because in America, you would never cycle at night. I mean, obviously there's safety from drunk driving. There's a safety issue. You don't have park connected networks that are well lit. So you would just culturally, you just never do those activities, right? All I'm just trying to say here is like, of course, when I was younger as a teenager, then it's like, oh, Singapore is bad because it's so not fun. You can't do anything, right? There's high taxes on alcohol, high taxes on cigarettes. There's so many things you can't do in Singapore. So there's a big push factor. It's like Singapore incorporated. The government is too corporate centric. You know what I mean? So all these push factors that make the pull factors of America way more positive. And I always like to tell people, it's like, sometimes like, you have to travel. I mean, it's like Lord of the Rings, right? There's this quote, right? It's like, not all who wander are lost, right? And the point of it is like, Frodo travels all the way to Mount Doom and, goes through a whole lot of pain. And then he goes back to the Shire, right? And he's a different person and nothing wrong with that, right? And I think one thing that happens sometimes is, sometimes I do notice that there are some Singaporeans who travel from Singapore and then go to America and come back. And they actually have this mentality like, oh, I failed. I failed to move to America, or other people, they hear from other people. It's like, oh, you tried to move to America, but you failed. You're a loser because you didn't move to America. As you think about what is appealing of America, you have more awareness about what is the push factors that directly correlate, right? Subconsciously, right? Whether it's your current job, your current profession, your current role, the country, the region. Right? But I think, and then you write those things down. And when you write those things down, journey, do it on paper, it'd be quite embarrassing. You're like, I don't like how, this part of culture. You write it all down. And then I think when you move to America, then you get a better sense, right? Because then it'll help you see some things in a different light, right? And so for me, for example, like, one thing I benefit from is like having moved back is like moving to America is so free, right? I can wear my tie-dye shirt, I can walk, I had long hair, right? I mean, I was California hippie in my undergraduate days. And some people will laugh when they remember this, right? But they cannot believe it when they hear me say this. But what I'm trying to say here is like, but when I came back to Singapore and now I have kids, and I was like, yeah, I'm happy for my kid to grow up and walk around at midnight. You know what I mean? Like that's a trade-off I'm willing to have. And I'm willing to be a little bit more boring now.
Yeah. And that's fine. Yeah.
And that's fine, right? Every strength is a weakness, right? Every power has its own shadow, right? And sometimes what we're unhappy about Singapore is a shadow of its strength, right? And what we like about America, the power of America may actually become more clearly, will cast a shadow of it, right? And I think, Silicon Valley is a good example of it, right? Which is that, this conversation they keep having over and over again, which is, you have a place where you have this techno-utopia optimists who are pushing this future of it. You have self-driving cars and robots and all AI stuff. And there's a homelessness and drug problem, right? And there's a cost of living crisis that's happening, right? So the soup, and then some people are like, oh, it's so weird. Why is such a dichotomy, cyberpunk dynamic where people are living in bubble communities, traveling in bubble self-driving cars, traveling to bubble, office campuses, right? With their bubble friends versus, the lived reality of, all these people who are struggling to make ends meet and work in California, right? So, and then people are like, oh, it's so weird. How do we fix it? And don't get me wrong. I think there are structural reasons. But also to some extent, those factors are a shadow of its powers, right? Does that make sense? So, that's kind of like, obviously there's a lot of good people like, Gary Khan at YC, he's pushing hard to like reform and push and build in San Francisco. I mean, I think there's a lot of good people who want to make things happen. So I obviously wish them the best of luck. And I'm actually really glad they're doing it because when I was in Berkeley, I used to work with the local nonprofits, right? I worked with local healthcare, local homelessness issues, local healthcare, right? Because I was a social impact consultant working as a volunteer in these organizations. And, it was a big surprise for me, to be honest, that between 2008 when I was there and now today, 2025, I guess effectively, the situation has gotten worse, right? For the issues that, that more money was put in, more effort, so many good people, the issues got worse, right? And there's all kinds of reasons for it. I'm not going to go into it. I'm not trying to make this into a, what is it? Social, political, economy tear down of the Silicon Valley, bargain, But I'm just trying to say here is, but just right now, a lot of people see the shadow of Singapore or the country, and to some extent, it also reflects their strengths, right? So, for example, you gave a conversation about culture, right? It's like, yeah, everybody's more. Simple one would be like, okay, America is very stranger friendly in Silicon Valley, but you can also make an argument that in Singapore, it's also a function of family, right? People in Singapore spend a lot more time with family, all right, and their prior networks. So there's a lot of high trust networks that build up over time, right? So versus in Silicon Valley, because everybody is relatively lower social history with each other, right? They're obviously more stranger friendly, which is good for new people coming in who don't have social history, right? So it's good for them to have a fresh start. But the shadow of that is, in Singapore, it's easier for you to have a family and so forth, right? So I think, and it's more family time, and everybody hangs out with their grandparents, and and I enjoy it actually. Really, for me right now, I'm like, oh, I get to hang out with my mom and dad, right? So, but in America, actually, in Silicon Valley, a lot of people are not living their mom and dad, right? Because most of those people, their parents are in Midwest or Florida, or whatever it is. So most people are like more nuclear, right? In that sense. So nothing bad. Could be good, could be bad, but I think that's something to be thoughtful about.
Thanks for sharing.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for asking questions. And hopefully this is helpful for folks who are in a similar spot.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.